The small, weathered town of Blackwood had always carried an air of mystery. It wasn't the kind of place people passed through often. The dense woods surrounding it seemed alive, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky as if to warn travelers away. Nestled in this foreboding place was an old inn called the Hollow Hearth, known among locals for its unnerving history and the peculiar occurrences reported by guests who dared stay the night. It was a chilly October evening when a young traveler named Marisa checked in. She was a freelance journalist working on a piece about haunted locations. The inn's lore made it the perfect subject. The Hollow Hearth was rumored to have been the site of a tragedy decades ago when a fire claimed the lives of a family who had been the innkeepers at the time. People whispered about the sound of children's laughter echoing in the dead of night, of phantom footsteps pacing the creaky hallways, and, most chillingly, a shadowy figure glimpsed in the corners of rooms. Marisa dismissed these tales as local folklore, but secretly hoped for a good story. The elderly innkeeper, Mrs. Halloway, gave her a knowing look as she handed over the key to room 6. "That room has a history," Mrs. Halloway said softly. "If you feel uneasy, just let me know. I won't charge you for leaving early." Marisa chuckled nervously, brushing off the warning. She lugged her bag up the narrow staircase to room 6, noticing the distinct coldness of the air despite the warmth of the hallway. The room itself was modest but charming in a worn, antique way. An old wardrobe stood against one wall, its dark wood polished to a sheen that seemed almost too perfect. A large mirror, framed in ornate brass, hung opposite the bed, its surface warped with age. As night fell, Marisa began reviewing her notes and recording voice memos about the town's history. Hours passed uneventfully until she caught a movement out of the corner of her eye. She glanced up at the mirror. At first, there was nothing unusual, but as she leaned closer, the reflection seemed wrong. The room in the mirror appeared subtly different. The wallpaper pattern didn't match, and the bed was adorned with a patchwork quilt instead of the plain white comforter she'd been given. She blinked, assuming she was just tired, and turned away. But as she crawled into bed and reached for the lamp, a soft, rhythmic creaking sound froze her hand mid-air. It was coming from the wardrobe. Marisa stared at the closed wardrobe door, her pulse quickening. She told herself it was just the old wood settling, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was unmistakable now, the sound of someone or something moving inside. Summoning her courage, she grabbed her phone and switched on the flashlight. Slowly, she approached the wardrobe, every nerve in her body screaming at her to stop. When she finally yanked the door open, there was nothing inside but empty hangers swaying gently as if disturbed moments ago. Marisa let out a shaky laugh, closed the wardrobe, and decided to call it a night. She switched off the lamp, pulled the blanket over her head, and tried to ignore the feeling that she wasn't alone. Around 3 a.m., she woke abruptly to the sensation of being watched. The room was pitch black, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. Then she heard it, a soft giggle, childlike and chilling, coming from the direction of the mirror. Her heart pounded as she slowly peeked out from under the blanket. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, the mirror reflected not her room but another, brighter one. 2 small children sat on the floor, playing with wooden blocks, their laughter echoing faintly. Marisa's breath hitched as the children turned toward her in unison. Their faces were pale, eyes sunken and empty, mouths stretched into wide, unnatural grins. Before she could scream, the scene shifted. A shadow moved behind her reflection, its outline tall and gaunt. She whipped around, but the room was empty. Turning back to the mirror, she saw the figure standing directly behind her reflection, its hand reaching for her shoulder. This time she did scream. Marisa bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock, and ran down the hall to the innkeeper's quarters. Mrs. Halloway opened the door immediately, her expression grim as if she had been expecting this. "You saw them, didn't you?" Mrs. Halloway asked. Marisa could only nod, her body trembling uncontrollably. "They're the children from the fire," Mrs. Halloway explained softly, "and the shadow, that's their father. He wasn't a kind man. He keeps them here, trapped, and sometimes he tries to keep others too." Marisa didn't stay to hear more. She grabbed her belongings and left the inn before sunrise, vowing never to return. The Hollow Hearth still stands to this day, its history whispered about by those brave or foolish enough to stay. And room 6? It remains locked. but guests sometimes report hearing the faint sound of children laughing through the walls, followed by the soft creak of footsteps pacing just outside their doors. The relentless storm had settled over the small mountain town of Pine Hollow, drowning the streets in torrential rain. Thunder rumbled low and deep, shaking the ground like a warning drum. Ellie, a nurse working the late shift at the local hospital, sighed as her car struggled up the winding road leading to her isolated cabin. She hated these storms, not just for the hazards, but for the memories they dredged up, whispers of Pine Hollow's long-buried past. The cabin was modest, tucked into a grove of tall pines. It had been her retreat after a messy divorce, a place to rebuild her life. But tonight, the woods seemed alive, the trees swaying like skeletal sentinels. She parked, grabbed her bag, and hurried inside, locking the door behind her. The wind howled against the windows as she tossed her coat over a chair and lit a single lamp, its golden glow casting long shadows. The cabin was unnervingly quiet, save for the storm outside. She decided to distract herself with some tea and a book. But as she reached for the kettle, she froze. There, on the window pane, was the faint impression of a handprint. It was smeared as if someone had pressed their palm there and dragged it downward. Her stomach twisted. She rationalized that it could have been from earlier, maybe when she'd opened the window to let in air that afternoon. But her gut told her otherwise. Shaking off the unease, Ellie made her tea and settled into her armchair. The rhythmic drumming of rain eased her nerves and she began to doze. The creak snapped her awake. It was faint, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. It came from the floorboards near the back door. Her eyes darted toward the shadows pooling in the corners of the room, her heartbeat quickening. The door was locked. She'd checked it twice. But the sound came again, louder this time. A deliberate groan of wood under weight. Gripping her phone, Ellie turned on the flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing. She exhaled shakily and decided to check the door. As she approached, another sound emerged. A faint tapping. Not on the door. On the window. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned the beam of light toward the glass. Outside, the storm raged, but in the brief flash of lightning, she saw it. A face. Pale and distorted, it pressed against the glass, its eyes wide and unblinking. She screamed and stumbled backward, the flashlight clattering to the floor. When she scrambled to retrieve it and shone it back, the face was gone. Her hands shook as she dialed the police. They assured her someone would come, but with the storm, it might take a while. Ellie locked herself in her bedroom, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The minutes dragged into hours, and though she tried to stay alert, exhaustion overtook her. She woke to silence. No rain, no wind. Just a dead, suffocating quiet. Her phone buzzed with a text. It was from the police. "We're on our way. Roads are clearing." But beneath it was another message, one she hadn't noticed before. It had been sent 2 hours earlier. "We checked the property. No signs of anyone outside. Are you sure you're alone in the house?" Her breath hitched. She hadn't heard anyone knock. The house had remained eerily silent. Then, as if in response to her thoughts, a soft creak came from the hallway outside her door. Ellie's hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Slowly, she cracked it open and peeked out. The hallway was empty. The hallway was in, but the door to the guest room was ajar, a door she distinctly remembered closing. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stepped into the hall, the floor icy beneath her feet. She crept toward the guest room, every fiber of her being screaming to turn back. The door creaked open further as she approached, revealing the dark, still interior. But something was wrong. The bed covers were rumpled as if someone had been sitting there. And then she saw it, a message scrawled in the condensation on the inside of the window. "You locked the doors, but not the attic." Ellie's scream died in her throat as she heard the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps descending the attic stairs behind her. The village of Ravensmoor was a place few outsiders ventured to visit. Its winding streets were lined with crooked houses that leaned together as if whispering secrets. But it wasn't the strange architecture or the ever-present fog that kept people away. It was the church. The old stone chapel stood at the heart of the village, its bell tower rising like a skeletal finger into the sky. For decades, no one had rung the bell. The locals whispered about what happened the last time it tolled, though no one would speak of it openly. Despite their silence, everyone knew the rule. Stay away from the church after dark. Daniel, a historian traveling through the area, had heard the rumors. Intrigued, he decided to spend a night in Ravensmoor to investigate the chapel's history. He was skeptical of ghost stories, preferring the rational explanations that history often provided. Renting a room at the village inn, he questioned the innkeeper about the church. The man's face darkened. "Best leave that place alone," the innkeeper muttered. "Some things are better forgotten." That only piqued Daniel's curiosity. That evening, armed with a flashlight and a notebook, he made his way to the chapel. The fog was thicker than he anticipated, swirling around him like living tendrils as he approached the crumbling structure. The air grew colder with each step. The chapel doors were heavy and warped with age, but they groaned open under his weight. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. The wooden pews were covered in dust, and the altar was adorned with tattered cloths that looked centuries old. Above it all loomed a massive crucifix, its figure of Christ strangely contorted, as if in agony beyond what the image typically conveyed. Daniel's flashlight flickered as he moved deeper inside. The chapel was silent except for the occasional drip of water somewhere in the shadows. He examined the carvings on the walls, Latin inscriptions mixed with strange symbols he didn't recognize. His heart raced with excitement. This was the kind of discovery that could make his career. But as he stood there, scribbling notes, a sound broke the silence, a low, mournful hum. It came from the direction of the bell tower. He froze, listening intently. The hum grew louder, more distinct, like a chorus of voices singing in a language he didn't understand. Despite a growing sense of dread, Daniel climbed the narrow, spiraling staircase to the bell tower. The steps creaked under his weight, and the air grew colder the higher he went. When he reached the top, he found the massive bell hanging lifelessly. Its surface was engraved with the same strange symbols he'd seen below. The humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew clearer with each passing second. "Help us," it said, the voice layered with others, as if a crowd were speaking in unison. Daniel turned, shining his flashlight into the shadows of the tower. That's when he saw them. Figures, pale and translucent, emerging from the darkness. Their faces were twisted in expressions of anguish, their eyes hollow and black. They reached for him, their mouths moving as they repeated the same plea. "Help us!" Panicking, Daniel stumbled back, his flashlight falling from his hand and shattering on the stone floor. The figures surged closer, their whispers turning into anguished wails. He ran, nearly tripping over the uneven steps as he fled down the tower. But the chapel had changed. The pews were gone, replaced by rows of skeletal figures kneeling in prayer. Their empty eye sockets followed him as he bolted toward the door. The altar was now lit with an unholy glow, and the crucifix above it seemed to writhe, the figure on it turning its head to watch him. As he reached the door, the bell tolled. The sound was deafening, reverberating through his chest like a physical force. He screamed, covering his ears, but the ringing wouldn't stop. He stumbled outside, collapsing onto the wet grass as the tolling finally ceased. When he looked back at the chapel, its windows glowed faintly, and the faint hum of voices echoed through the night. Daniel didn't stay to investigate further. He left Ravensmoor before dawn, his notes abandoned in his rush to escape. He never spoke of what happened, but locals say that after that night, the bell would occasionally toll on its own, always at midnight. And with each toll, another villager would vanish, leaving behind nothing but a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Help us!" The Peterson family's farmhouse sat on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town, surrounded by miles of empty fields. The property had been in their family for generations, but it was old and falling apart. After their father's death, siblings Emily and James decided to move back temporarily to sort through the estate. The house was filled with memories, but it also carried an oppressive air, as if it had absorbed decades of grief. The first night, Emily woke to the sound of creaking floorboards. At first, she thought it was James walking around, but when she called out, there was no response. She got up and checked the hallway. It was empty. Assuming the old house was just settling, she went back to bed. The next morning, James looked exhausted. He told Emily he'd had a strange dream about their late father standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him without saying a word. His face had been pale, almost waxy, and his eyes, they weren't right. Emily brushed it off as stress. They'd both been through a lot lately. But that evening, as they were sorting through boxes in the attic, something strange happened. James found an old wooden box tucked behind a pile of broken furniture. Inside were faded photographs of people they didn't recognize. All of the people in the photos looked wrong. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too dark. In one photo, a woman's hand seemed to have an extra finger, though the rest of her looked normal. "This must have belonged to someone before our family bought the house," Emily said, though her voice was uncertain. They set the box aside, uneasy but too tired to dwell on it. That night, Emily woke again. This time, it wasn't creaking floorboards, but the faint sound of crying. It was soft and high-pitched, like a child. She froze, listening. The sound seemed to come from downstairs. Her heart pounded as she crept to her door and peeked out. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows. The crying grew louder. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound down the staircase, gripping the railing tightly. As she reached the bottom, the crying abruptly stopped. "James?" she called out, her voice shaking. No answer. She turned toward the living room, and that's when she saw it. A shadow standing in the corner, and its form impossibly tall and thin. It didn't move, but she could feel it watching her. The air grew heavy, and a chill ran down her spine. Slowly, the shadow began to stretch, its limbs elongating unnaturally. Emily screamed and ran back upstairs, slamming her bedroom door shut and locking it. The next morning, she told James what she'd seen, expecting him to laugh or tell her she'd imagined it. But instead, his face turned pale. He admitted that he'd seen the same shadow in his room the night before. They decided to leave that day, but as they were packing, the atmosphere in the house seemed to shift. The air became thick and oppressive, and they kept hearing faint whispers, though they couldn't make out the words. Just as they were about to load the last box into the car, Emily realized she'd left her phone upstairs. Against her instincts, she ran back inside to grab it. As she reached her bedroom, she saw the wooden box from the attic sitting on her bed, though neither she nor James had brought it down. The photographs were scattered across the bedspread. In the center was a new photo, one that hadn't been there before. It was of Emily and James, standing in the living room of the farmhouse. Their expressions blank, their eyes unnervingly dark. A cold breath brushed the back of her neck, and a low, guttural voice whispered, "You can't leave." Emily didn't look back. She grabbed her phone and bolted from the house. She and James drove away, leaving everything behind. They never spoke about what happened, and they never returned. The farmhouse still stands, abandoned and rotting. But sometimes people driving past at night claim they see lights flickering in the windows and shadowy figures moving inside. And if you're brave, or foolish, enough to step onto the property, you might hear faint whispers carried on the wind, warning you to leave before it's too late. In the remote hills of Appalachia, nestled deep within the woods, there was a cabin known only in whispers as the Silent Rest. No one knew who built it or why, but everyone knew to avoid it. The locals claimed it was cursed, a place where sound itself seemed to vanish. Animals avoided the area, and even the wind seemed to die down near the cabin. Jake was an amateur photographer with a penchant for the macabre. When he heard about the cabin during a local ghost tour, he decided to see it for himself. The guide had warned him against it, but Jake laughed it off. Stories like these were always exaggerated, he thought. He parked his car at the edge of the woods and hiked the remaining mile to the cabin. The forest grew denser as he went, the trees gnarled and twisted as though they had been writhing in agony for years. The only sounds were the crunch of his boots on dead leaves and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. As he approached the clearing, the air felt different, heavy, oppressive. The cabin came into view, its wooden planks warped and blackened with age. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently. The strange thing was the silence, no birds, no insects, no wind. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Jake raised his camera and snapped a few pictures of the exterior. The soft click of the shutter felt deafening in the unnatural quiet. He stepped onto the creaking porch and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale and cold, and the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally in the corners. The cabin was sparsely furnished, an old table, a single chair, and a bed frame with a moldy mattress. The walls were covered in scratches, as if something or someone had clawed at them desperately. In the center of the room was a circular mark on the floor, its edges charred as though something had burned there. Jake felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, but ignored it. He began snapping more photos, moving around the room to capture every eerie detail. As he reviewed the shots on his camera, his stomach dropped. In each photo, faint shapes appeared in the shadows, figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces, their mouths frozen in silent screams. A loud thud came from behind him, breaking the oppressive silence. Jake spun around, but the room was empty. He laughed nervously, convincing himself it was just the door slamming shut from a draft. But when he checked the door, it was still open. Then he felt it. A cold breath on his neck. He froze, his camera slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The silence deepened, so intense that even his own panicked breathing seemed muffled. He turned slowly, and there it was, a figure impossibly tall and emaciated, its face a mask of pale, stretched skin. Its eyes were deep pits of darkness, and its mouth opened wide, but no sound emerged. Jake backed away, but the figure glided closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. He bolted for the door, but as he reached it, the air seemed to thicken, like invisible hands were holding him in place. He clawed at the doorway, desperate to escape, but the silence pressed down on him, deafening and suffocating. And then the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder, overlapping and coming from every direction. Words in a language he couldn't understand filled his ears, each one making his head pound and his vision blur. He screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing Jake saw before darkness consumed him was the figure leaning down, its face inches from his own. Its hollow eyes stared into him as its mouth moved, forming words Jake could only feel, not hear. "Stay with us." When the locals finally went searching for Jake after he failed to return, they found his car, but no sign of him. The cabin looked as it always had, abandoned and untouched. Inside, they found his camera lying on the floor. The last photo it captured was blurry, but in the center of the frame was a pale, twisted face staring directly at the lens, its hollow eyes seeming to watch whoever dared to look. The silent rest still stands, waiting for its next visitor. On the edge of an old coastal town stood the lighthouse of Graycliff, battered by years of violent storms and forgotten by time. Locals called it cursed, claiming the beacon hadn't worked in decades. Yet, on some nights, a faint, eerie light could be seen circling through the fog, even though no one had been stationed there for years. Claire, a journalist chasing stories of the supernatural, arrived in Graycliff on a misty October evening. She had heard the rumors about the lighthouse and the sailors who claimed to hear voices crying out for help over the waves. Determined to uncover the truth, she rented a room in town and planned her trek to the desolate structure. As she walked along the rocky shoreline toward the lighthouse, the fog thickened, curling around her like ghostly fingers. The sound of the crashing waves seemed distant, muffled, as if she had entered another world. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its dark silhouette against the gray sky unnervingly still. The door creaked open with a push, and Claire stepped inside. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang. Dust coated every surface, and the spiral staircase leading to the top disappeared into shadows. With her flashlight in hand, Claire began her ascent. Each step echoed loudly in the enclosed space. About halfway up, she paused. There it was. A whisper. Faint and fleeting, like the sound of someone calling her name from far away. Claire? Her stomach tightened, but she pressed on, convinced it was her imagination. The observation room at the top was a ruin of rusted machinery and shattered glass. The lamp itself was cold and lifeless, its massive lens cracked. Claire set up her camera, snapping photos and jotting down notes. That's when she noticed the condensation on the glass panes of the lantern room. There were words. Scrawled into the misted glass were the words, "Help me." Claire's breath hitched. She wiped the glass with her sleeve, but the writing was gone. Her pulse raced as she turned back to her camera, only to find it had been moved, several feet away from where she had placed it. Her flashlight flickered. Claire. The voice was louder now, clearer, and it was unmistakably coming from the staircase below. She froze, her mind racing. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside without her seeing them. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The only response was a distant, guttural moan that sent a shiver down her spine. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of salt and decay became overwhelming. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but as she reached the staircase, the door at the base of the lighthouse slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the tower, and suddenly the walls seemed to vibrate with whispers. Dozens of voices, layered and overlapping, filled the air. They were pleading, crying, shouting in anguish. Panicking, Claire bolted down the staircase, her flashlight shaking wildly as the whispers grew into a deafening roar. She reached the door and yanked it open, stumbling out into the cold night. But the beach was gone. She turned in every direction, but all she could see was the dense fog stretching endlessly. The lighthouse behind her now shone brightly, its beam sweeping across the void. The light passed over her, and for a brief moment she saw them, figures in the mist, dozens of them, their forms barely human, their faces twisted and gaunt. They were reaching for her. The whispers turned into screams as the figures closed in. Claire ran, but the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, pulling her back toward the lighthouse. She tripped and fell, her hands scraping against the wet, rocky ground. The last thing she saw was the beam of light sweeping over her again, illuminating a face mere inches from hers. It was pale and waterlogged, its eyes black pits that seemed to pull her into their depths. Claire was never seen again. Her camera washed up on the shore weeks later, its memory card intact. The final photograph was of the lighthouse bathed in an eerie glow, its beam cutting through the fog. And in the foreground was Claire, standing at the edge of the observation room, staring into the lens with a vacant expression, her eyes as black as the sea beneath her. The lighthouse at Greycliff still shines its ghostly light on foggy nights, and some say if you listen closely, you can hear Claire's voice among the whispers, calling for help from somewhere beyond the mist. In a quiet suburb nestled at the end of an overgrown cul-de-sac stood an abandoned house known as the Thatcher Home. Once a grand estate, it had been vacant for decades after the Thatcher family mysteriously vanished. Neighbors whispered about strange lights in the windows and the occasional sound of laughter echoing from the empty halls. Despite its derelict state, no one dared to tear it down or move in. Mia and her friends, all thrill seekers and skeptics of the paranormal, decided to explore the house on Halloween night. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they arrived at the crumbling property just as the moon reached its peak. The air was unnaturally still, and the house seemed to loom over them, its windows like empty eye sockets staring into their souls. The front door creaked open as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The grand staircase was splintered but intact, and faded wallpaper peeled away to reveal the scars of time. "Creepy," one of Mia's friends muttered, her voice echoing in the eerie silence. As they moved deeper into the house, the atmosphere grew heavier, as though the air itself didn't want them there. They found a room that appeared to be a parlor. A piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. Mia couldn't resist. She pressed one of the keys, and the discordant note echoed unnervingly through the house. "Did you hear that?" Another friend whispered, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Everyone froze. The note she played had echoed, but then there was a faint second sound, as if someone else had pressed a key in response. The group exchanged uneasy glances but dismissed it as the acoustics of the house. They ventured upstairs, where the rooms were in worse disrepair. One room, however, seemed oddly preserved. It was a child's bedroom, complete with a small bed, a toy chest, and faded drawings on the walls. On the bed was a doll. Its face was cracked porcelain, and its eyes, though lifeless, seemed to follow them as they moved. Mia picked it up, inspecting it. "Don't," one of her friends warned, but Mia only laughed. "It's just a doll," she said, placing it back on the bed. As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The group screamed, scrambling to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and childlike, filled the room. "Who's there?" Mia shouted, her voice trembling. The laughter stopped abruptly. Then, from the toy chest, came the sound of shuffling. One of her friends, braver than the rest, approached it. He hesitated before opening the lid. Inside were old, tattered toys and something else. A photograph. It was a family portrait of the Thatchers, but the faces were blurred, distorted as if they had melted. In the background, standing just behind them, was a figure dressed in black with glowing eyes. The chest slammed shut on its own, and the laughter returned. Louder, more sinister. The doll was no longer on the bed. It was on the floor, sitting upright, its head tilted toward the group. Panic set in. They pounded on the door, screaming for it to open. Finally, with a groan, it swung wide and they ran for the stairs. But the house seemed to shift around them. The hallway stretched endlessly and the walls appeared to pulse as if alive. The laughter followed them, now mixed with whispers that seemed to come from all directions. "Stay with us," the voices said. "We've been waiting." One by one, the friends began to disappear. Mia turned to find she was alone, the whispers growing louder, the laughter turning to cries. She ran, bursting through the front door and collapsing on the overgrown lawn. When she looked back, the house was dark and silent. There was no sign of her friends. Mia fled the cul-de-sac and called the police. When they arrived, they found no evidence of anyone inside the house. The officers dismissed her story as a Halloween prank gone wrong, but Mia knew what she had seen and heard. The next day, she found the doll sitting on her front porch, its cracked porcelain face smiling up at her. Attached to it was a note written in a child's handwriting. "We had fun. Come back soon." No one has seen Mia since. In a sleepy, forgotten town tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains, there was a dense forest known as Black Hollow. For generations, the locals spoke of the Watcher, a figure said to inhabit the woods. No one knew what the Watcher was, only that those who entered the hollow after dark never returned. Anna, a curious backpacker who had been exploring the region, heard the legend at a small diner. The old man who told her the story grew pale as he spoke, his hands trembling. "They say it sees you before you even step into the trees," he warned. "Once it's watching, it doesn't stop. Not until it gets what it wants." Anna, dismissing it as small-town superstition, decided to venture into Black Hollow anyway. She loved unraveling local myths, and the thought of solving the mystery excited her. She packed her flashlight, a map, and a camera before setting out just before sunset. The forest was beautiful at first. Mass golden light filtered through the thick canopy and the scent of pine filled the air. But as the sun dipped lower, the atmosphere began to change. Shadows stretched longer, and the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds, just silence. Then she saw it. At the edge of her vision, something moved between the trees, a dark figure, impossibly tall and thin. She froze, her heart racing. When she looked directly at the spot, there was nothing there. Anna shook her head, laughing nervously. "Get it together," she muttered to herself and pressed on. Minutes turned into hours, and the trail on her map seemed to vanish. The trees began to look identical, their trunks gnarled and twisted. She tried to retrace her steps, but the path behind her was gone, replaced by more dense forest. That's when she heard it, a faint rustling, like footsteps crunching leaves. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the faint sound of movement circling her. She spun around, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The rustling stopped. She took a step forward and stumbled over something, a small pile of stones arranged in a perfect circle. In the center lay a single black feather, unnaturally large and glossy. Anna felt an icy chill crawl up her spine. The rustling began again, louder now, closer. She shone her flashlight into the trees and screamed. Two glowing eyes stared back at her, suspended far higher than any human should have stood. The figure emerged, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long and bent. Its face was featureless, smooth as polished stone, except for the glowing eyes that never blinked. Anna turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around her, their branches clawing at her clothes and skin. Behind her, the sound of snapping twigs and heavy, deliberate footsteps grew louder. She tripped and fell, her flashlight skittering away into the darkness. Scrambling to her feet, she grabbed her camera and blindly snapped photos, the flash briefly illuminating the woods around her. For a moment, the footsteps stopped. She turned, panting, and saw nothing but trees. The oppressive silence returned, and she dared to hope she'd escaped. Then a voice, low and guttural, whispered from the darkness, "Why run?" The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. She spun in every direction, but there was nothing. The flashlight flickered back to life, and as she swept the beam across the forest, the Watcher stood inches from her, its blank face tilted slightly as if studying her. Anna screamed, and everything went black. The next morning, hikers found her backpack at the edge of Black Hollow, neatly placed as if waiting to be picked up. Her camera was still inside, its memory card intact. When the police reviewed the photos, most were blurry shots of trees and darkness. But the final image was crystal clear. Anna, standing in the forest, her eyes wide with terror. Behind her, the watcher loomed, one elongated hand resting on her shoulder, its glowing eyes piercing through the lens. Anna was never seen again, and those who venture too close to Black Hollow claim they sometimes hear whispers in the trees, asking softly, "Why run?" In the quiet town of Everbrook, there was an unassuming little shop called the Midnight Curio. It was open only after sunset, and its owner, an elderly man named Mr. Greaves, was rarely seen during the day. The shop sold oddities, antique clocks, rusted keys, cracked porcelain dolls, but what set it apart was its reputation. Every item in the Midnight Curio was said to have a story, and not all of them ended well. Lila, a college student with a love for the unusual, stumbled upon the shop one chilly November evening. She'd been wandering through town when she noticed the faint glow of its sign and felt inexplicably drawn to it. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and something metallic. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with strange and mismatched objects. Mr. Greaves appeared from behind the counter, his pale eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Looking for something special?" he asked, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone that made Lila shiver. Lila browsed for a while before her attention was drawn to a small, tarnished music box. Its design was intricate, with swirling patterns and tiny gemstones embedded in its surface. She picked it up and wound the key. The melody that played was hauntingly beautiful, yet there was something off about it, an eerie dissonance beneath the notes. "How much for this?" she asked. Mr. Greaves' expression turned grave. "That one," he said slowly, "comes with a warning." Lila raised an eyebrow, amused. "A warning? Do not let it play itself," he said. "Only wind it yourself, and never, under any circumstance, let it run while you sleep." Lila, thinking it was part of the sales pitch, laughed it off. She bought the music box and left, excited to add it to her growing collection of peculiar items. That night, in her small apartment, she wound the box again, listening to the strange melody as she prepared for bed. It was captivating, almost hypnotic. She placed it on her nightstand and fell asleep, forgetting Mr. Greaves' warning. She woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the music box playing on its own. The melody was slower now, more distorted, as if it were being dragged through molasses. She sat up, her heart pounding, and reached to stop it, but the lid snapped shut before she could touch it. The room plunged into silence. Then she noticed the shadow. It moved across her wall, though there was no light source to cast it. At first, it was small, like the silhouette of a child, but it grew, stretching unnaturally tall and thin. It paused, its head tilting as if it were studying her. Lila froze, unable to scream. The music box lid creaked open again, and the warped melody resumed. The shadow moved, crawling across the wall and ceiling, its limbs bending in ways that made her stomach churn. Suddenly, it darted toward her, enveloping the room in darkness. Lila woke the next morning on the floor, her body ice cold and the music box closed. She convinced herself it had been a nightmare, though the unease lingered. She resolved to return the music box to the shop, but when she went back, the Midnight Curio was gone. The space where it had been was boarded up, and a passerby told her it had been abandoned for years. Confused and frightened, Lila returned home, only to find the music box sitting on her nightstand, as if it had been waiting for her. That night, she tried throwing it away, burying it in the trash, but when she returned to her apartment, it was back in its place, the key gleaming as if freshly polished. The following nights were worse. The music box played itself every time she fell asleep, and the shadow grew bolder, no longer content to stay on the walls. She felt it touch her, icy fingers brushing her skin. Her reflection in the mirror began to change, her eyes darkening and her smile twisting into something unrecognizable. Desperate, Lila searched for any information about the Midnight Curio or its cursed items. She found a single article about Mr. Greaves dated decades earlier. The shop, it said, was a trap for the desperate and the curious. Its items were cursed, bound to their owners until they claimed their lives. The last entry in the article read, "Once you take it, you can't escape it. It becomes yours, and you become its." Lila was last seen by her neighbors muttering to herself, clutching the music box tightly as she walked into the woods. The box was found weeks later, sitting on a shelf in the abandoned space where the midnight curio had once stood, waiting for the next unwitting soul to claim it. There was a road outside of town that everyone knew to avoid after dark. Locals called it Dead Man's Stretch, a narrow, winding path cutting through a dense forest. The road had a reputation, not for accidents, though there had been many, but for something worse. Drivers reported seeing strange figures on the roadside or in their rearview mirrors. Others said their radios would play static, punctuated by whispers, voices calling their names. Tommy, a delivery driver working the late shift, didn't believe the stories. Superstition, he thought, and nothing more. He'd driven the road dozens of times without incident. But one fateful night, as he was heading home from a late delivery, he found himself on Dead Man's Stretch well past midnight. The forest pressed in on either side of the road, the trees so dense they seemed to swallow his headlights. His radio fizzled, losing the station, and an uneasy silence settled over the truck. He reached to change the channel, but all he got was static. That's when he saw her, a woman, standing on the side of the road, just beyond the reach of his headlights. She was dressed in white, her long hair obscuring her face. She didn't move as he approached, and for a moment he considered stopping to help her. But something in his gut screamed, no. As he passed her, she vanished, just gone, as if she had dissolved into the air. His heart raced, and he kept driving, gripping the wheel tightly. A mile later, he glanced in his rearview mirror and slammed on the brakes. She was sitting in the bed of his truck. Tommy turned around, his hands shaking, but the truck bed was empty. His breathing quickened, and he told himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. He kept driving, the road seeming to stretch endlessly. The trees all looked the same, and the darkness was suffocating. Then he heard it, a faint knock. It came from the passenger side window. Tommy didn't dare look, but out of the corner of his eye he saw her face pressed against the glass. Pale, with hollow black eyes and a mouth twisted into a chilling smile. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. The truck swerved as he tried to ignore it, his foot pressing harder on the gas. Finally, the knocking stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Relief washed over him for a brief moment, but then the cab grew cold. His breath fogged in the air, and the smell of earth and decay filled his nose. "Why didn't you stop?" a voice whispered in his ear. Tommy screamed and veered off the road, the truck crashing into a ditch. When he came to, his head was pounding, and the cab was empty. He scrambled out, his knees shaking, and looked around. The forest was silent, save for the rustle of leaves in the wind. As he turned back to his truck, he froze. The woman was standing in front of it, her head tilted unnaturally to one side, her black eyes locked on his. "You left me," she said, her voice a guttural hiss. Tommy backed away, stumbling over roots and rocks. She didn't move, but her presence seemed to pull the air from his lungs. He turned and ran, the sound of her laughter echoing behind him, growing louder, more manic. He didn't stop until he reached a gas station miles away. Bursting inside, he tried to explain what had happened, but the clerk just shook his head. "You're lucky," the man said grimly. "Most don't make it off that road." Tommy never drove Dead Man's Stretch again, and he moved to another town shortly after. But sometimes, late at night, he would hear knocking on his window or see a flash of white in his rearview mirror, and he knew she was still waiting for him to stop.